The Tudors Dynasty Podcast.
Hello and welcome back to the Tudors Dynasty Podcast, where we dive into the lives of fascinating figures from royal courts across Europe. I'm your host, Rebecca Larson, and today we have not one, but two queens to explore. Maria Amalia of Saxony, Queen of Spain, and Elizabeth of Bohemia. Two women whose lives were filled with political intrigue, personal heartbreak, and lasting legacies. Let's begin with Maria Amalia. Maria Amalia was born in 1724 into the powerful Wettin dynasty. Her father, Augustus III, was King of Poland and Elector of Saxony, and her mother, Maria Josephina of Austria, was an archduchess. Being a member of such a politically important family, Maria Amalia's future was always going to be shaped by diplomacy and a strategic marriage. Her marriage to Charles Bourbon in 1738 was no exception. It was arranged to secure an alliance between Spain, Saxony, and Austria. At the age of 14, Maria Amalia left her home in Saxony to join Charles in his Neapolitan court. This must have been quite the adjustment for the young princess, moving from her familiar surroundings in Dresden to the sunny, bustling city of Naples. But Maria Amalia quickly adapted, and Naples would become a central part of her legacy. In fact, her years in Naples were perhaps the most formative of her life, both personally and politically. Charles and Maria Amalia seem to have had a more affectionate relationship than many of their royal counterparts. While many royal marriages were strictly political and often distant, Maria Amalia became a close confidant to Charles. He trusted her judgment and sought her counsel on matters of state, something that speaks volumes about her intelligence and influence. Their partnership would become a defining feature of Charles's reign in both Naples and later Spain. But one of the most fascinating aspects of Maria Amalia's life was her role as cultural patron, particularly in Naples. One of her most lasting achievements was her involvement in the construction of the Caserta Palace. Imagine Versailles in France, but with Italian flair. Maria Amalia had a great passion for the arts and architecture, and she personally oversaw many of the details of the palace's design. There's a great story about how she wasn't satisfied with the original plans for the grand staircase. In her view, the staircase needed to not just be a functional feature of the palace, but a statement of grandeur. She insisted on changes to the design, and the result is nothing short of breathtaking. One of the most iconic staircases in Europe. It's a perfect example of how involved she was in ensuring that the palace reflected the cultural prestige that she had envisioned. It wasn't just architecture that captured Maria Amalia's attention. She was also a patron of music and the arts, encouraging the court to embrace the Neapolitan style, while also blending in elements from Saxony and Austria. Many credit her with helping to elevate Naples to one of the cultural centers of 18th century Europe. Now let's turn to her life in Spain. In 1759, after the death of his half-brother Ferdinand VI, Charles was called to the Spanish throne, and Maria Amalia became Queen of Spain. But unlike her long and influential time in Naples, her years in Spain were marked by tragedy. Maria Amalia only lived in Madrid for a little over a year before she fell ill and died in 1760 at the age of 35. Her death left Charles absolutely devastated. This was not just the loss of a queen, it was a loss of his closest partner. Charles was so grief-stricken that he never remarried, which was quite unusual for a king of this time, particularly one with such dynastic responsibilities. Charles kept Maria Amalia's memory alive throughout his reign, commissioning works of art in her honor, and ensuring that her legacy would not be forgotten. One of the lesser-known aspects of Maria Amalia's legacy is the role she played in shaping the future of her children. The couple had 13 children together, though not all survived infancy. Among the surviving children was Charles IV, who would go on to become King of Spain. There was also their daughter, Maria Luisa, who married Leopold II and became Holy Roman Empress, placing Maria Amalia's bloodline at the heart of European politics for generations to come. What's also interesting is how Maria Amalia's influence lived on through Charles's policies. Though she passed away early in his reign, it's clear that her advice and counsel stayed with him. Charles III would go on to be one of Spain's most successful reforming monarchs, and many historians believe that Maria Amalia's early influence helped guide his progressive reforms, particularly in areas like education and urban development. Her life may have been short, but Maria Amalia left a lasting mark not only on Naples and Spain, but also on the broader European political landscape. Whether it was through her architectural legacy, her role as cultural patron, or her political influence, she shaped the course of two major European courts. It's a reminder that behind many of the great male monarchs of history were influential and powerful women who often shaped the destiny of nations from behind the scenes. Maria Amalia of Saxony's legacy as Queen of Spain was one of resilience, cultural patronage, and political maneuvering. Her contributions to the Spanish court left a lasting imprint. Now, as we shift our focus from the splendor of the 18th century in Spain, we're going to travel back a few centuries to the medieval world of 14th century Bohemia. While Maria Amalia's challenges were rooted in maintaining influence with the Bourbon dynasty, Elizabeth of Bohemia faced an entirely different set of struggles, marked by personal tragedy, political exile, and the complexities of medieval European power. Let's dive into the life of Elizabeth of Bohemia, a queen whose resilience, like Maria Amalia's, continues to resonate through the ages. Elizabeth was born into a powerful dynasty. Her father, Wenceslaus II, was king of Bohemia and Poland, and her mother, Judith of Habsburg, was a member of the influential Habsburg family, which would go on to dominate European politics for centuries. But despite being born into such privilege, Elizabeth's early life was marred by loss. Out of her 10 siblings, only 4 survived to adulthood. When she was just 5 years old, her mother died. By the time she was 13, her father had passed away as well, leaving Elizabeth orphaned in a court rife with political instability. Following her father's death in 1305, Elizabeth went to live with her older sister Anne, who had married Henry, Duke of Carinthia. Now, at first glance, this might seem like a stable arrangement. Anne and Henry's marriage placed them in a powerful position, especially after the assassination of Elizabeth's brother, Wenceslaus III, in 1306. With Wenceslaus's death, Henry was crowned King of Bohemia, and Anne became queen. Elizabeth, living under her sister's roof, was expected to align herself with her sister's political plans. However, this is where the story takes a dramatic turn. Elizabeth and Anne didn't have the easiest of relationships, and the tensions between them began to grow when Anne tried to orchestrate a marriage for Elizabeth. Anne wanted Elizabeth to marry a political ally, which was typical for royal families at the time. But here's where we see Elizabeth's strong-willed nature emerge. She refused. Instead of agreeing to marry her sister's chosen suitor, Elizabeth decided to follow her own path, an incredibly bold move for a woman in the early 14th century. Elizabeth's refusal to marry her sister's choice strained their relationship beyond repair. Rather than submit to Anne's political maneuvering, Elizabeth took a daring step. In 1310, she married John of Luxembourg, a son of the Holy Roman Emperor, Henry VII. Now, this wasn't just a marriage, this was a power move. John of Luxembourg wasn't a passive figure in this arrangement. In fact, shortly after their marriage, John led an invasion of Bohemia on Elizabeth's behalf, claiming the throne for himself and his new wife. By February 1311, John and Elizabeth were crowned King and Queen of Bohemia. And now for an anecdote that really highlights the tension between the sisters. After John successfully claimed the Bohemian throne for Elizabeth, Anne and her husband Henry fled back to Carinthia, their power in Bohemia shattered. It's said that on their departure, Anne was bitterly resentful toward her younger sister, viewing her marriage to John and their subsequent rise to power as a betrayal. Anne lived out her remaining years in Carinthia, and the sisters never reconciled. Anne died in 1313, leaving behind a fractured relationship with Elizabeth, one of many personal conflicts that would mark Elizabeth's life. Despite this triumph, Elizabeth's life as queen was far from easy. While her marriage to John of Luxembourg was politically advantageous, it was also deeply unhappy. The couple had 7 children together, though not all survived to adulthood. Elizabeth's first few years as queen saw tension not only in her marriage but in the governance of the kingdom. John's political ambitions often clashed with Elizabeth's vision for Bohemia, leading to disagreements that would come to define their relationship. One of the most significant turning points in their marriage came in 1316 with the birth of their son, Charles, who would later become Charles IV, Holy Roman Emperor. The birth of an heir offered a brief improvement in their strained marriage, but it wasn't enough to resolve their deeper differences. One of the most painful aspects for Elizabeth was her lack of control over her children's upbringing. John refused to allow her to have a say in the education of their 3 eldest children, including young Charles. Elizabeth's frustration with John's authoritarian control over their children led her to take a dramatic step in 1322. She left Bohemia and fled to Bavaria. In exile, she gave birth to her last children, twin daughters. But tragedy followed Elizabeth, even into exile, as one of the twins died at just 1 year old. Elizabeth's life in Bavaria was not easy. Despite her status as Queen of Bohemia, she had no financial support from John, and her political influence had waned. Here's where another anecdote highlights Elizabeth's sheer resilience. During her time in exile, Elizabeth was largely abandoned by her husband. John, deeply entrenched in his political schemes, offered her no support, leaving her isolated and financially dependent on others. Even as queen, Elizabeth found herself powerless and without the means to maintain her own court. But instead of resigning herself to this fate, Elizabeth fought back in the only way she could. She returned to Bohemia in 1325 with her surviving daughter. It's remarkable to think about the courage it took for her to return, knowing she had little power or resources. Her return to Bohemia, however, did not mark a return to power. John continued to exclude her from the affairs of the kingdom, and Elizabeth's health was beginning to fail. She had long suffered from tuberculosis, and the years of stress, exile, and political strife had taken their toll. In 1330, at just 38 years old, Elizabeth of Bohemia died of tuberculosis. Despite her title, her royal lineage, and her status as the mother of future Holy Roman Emperor, she spent her final years in relative obscurity and without the financial independence she deserved. Her life is a striking example of how those born into royalty could experience isolation and powerlessness. Elizabeth of Bohemia spent her life battling the expectations placed upon her as a royal woman. Whether it was defying her sister's plans for marriage, fighting for her own influence in Bohemia, or trying to secure a future for her children, Elizabeth's story is one of perseverance and quiet defiance in the face of adversity. But despite the personal struggles and political tensions, Elizabeth did leave a lasting legacy. Her son, Charles IV, would go on to become one of the most influential rulers of medieval Europe. As Holy Roman Emperor, Charles IV helped solidify the power and influence of the Luxembourg dynasty, ensuring that his mother's bloodline would remain at the center of European politics for generations to come. As we wrap up this episode, let's take a moment to reflect on the lives of the two remarkable women we've explored today, Maria Amalia of Saxony and Elizabeth of Bohemia. Both queens, though from different centuries and regions, shared experiences that define them as strong and resilient figures in European history. Maria Amalia of Saxony, Queen of Spain, may have been born into glittering courts of Saxony, but her life was far from simple. As queen consort, she stood alongside her husband, Charles III, during a transformative period in Spanish history. Her cultural patronage and devotion to the arts left an indelible mark on the Spanish court. And while her position as queen might suggest a life of luxury, her role in the Bourbon dynasty came with its share of challenges, particularly in navigating the politics of European alliances and maintaining her household's influence in the broader royal landscape. And then we have Elizabeth of Bohemia, a woman whose journey was fraught with personal loss, family betrayal, and political exile. Orphaned at a young age and thrust into a world of intrigue, Elizabeth defied her sister's plans for her future, choosing instead to forge her own path. Her life may have been filled with hardship, including an unhappy marriage and exile from her own kingdom, but her strength and perseverance are what define her legacy. Even in her death, her impact lived on through her son, Charles IV, Holy Roman Emperor. Thank you so much for joining me for today's episode. I hope you enjoyed learning more about these two extraordinary queens and their contributions to the royal legacies they left behind. Be sure to tune in next week as we uncover more stories from the royal past. I'm your host, Rebecca Larson. Until next time. Take care and keep exploring history.
Thank you so much for listening to another episode of the Tudors Dynasty podcast. If you love the show and would like to show your support, please head on over to my Patreon page. That's Patreon, patreon.com/Tudors Dynasty for more information. Over there, you're going to find commercial-free episodes. You'll get early access, and there's some exclusive content as well, with more stuff to come as I'm rebuilding it. Also, recently I returned from England and cannot wait to go back. But this time, I would love to bring you with me. So if you're interested to go on a tour of England with me, why don't you send me an email, Rebecca@tudorsdynasty.com, for more information. Thank you so much for listening. Until next time.
The Tudors Dynasty Podcast.